Welcome to the On the Blue Line podcast. I'm your host, Wayne Mulder, and I'm excited to be back with you again this week. Today on Morning Roll Call, we go over the Bronx man who smashed up the McDonald's with an axe. You'll recall I talked about that a couple weeks ago. Well, he's back in the criminal justice system, a term that is seemingly becoming an oxymoron. But anyway, he's back in the system. We'll go over that yet again. Secondly, it is high past time to ban knives. And yes, I said knives, and I mean all of them. High-capacity steak knives, sharp knives, dull knives, rusty knives, dirty knives, and even the seemingly innocuous but easily accessible butter knives. It's time for a knife buyback program, I think. I mean, I say since there is nothing saying our rights to butter knives shall not be infringed, maybe it is high time we infringe upon them. And we'll go over a study that supports that today. Next, we turn to the increasingly frustrating tales of a deadly force incident that wasn't. And then lastly, we turn to science to dispute the outcome of Hollywood's latest blockbuster, Top Gun Maverick. And then we go over do more than is asked, do more than is expected. And, the fact that this is no longer taught or expected, well, that's tragic. Morning Roll Call starts now. All right, if this is the first time you're joining us, welcome. This is the 129th episode of the podcast, and I really am thankful for each and every one of you that takes time out of your schedule to listen or to watch. If no matter what platform you're watching this on, if you would just click that subscribe button, or if you're listening on any of the podcast streaming services, I'd appreciate if you would subscribe to our channel. Secondly, be sure to follow us on any and almost all social media platforms, really, literally almost all of them. And it's at On the Blue Line Podcast. And then lastly, if you're not a member of our Facebook community, which is On the Blue Line Community, again, pretty simple. We like things simple around here. Then I invite you to please join us there. If this is your first time listening to us, this episode or this show is called Morning Roll Call. I come to you once a week, usually on Mondays, and we take 20 minutes or so. We discuss a few news stories, and then we discuss something actionable for you for the week ahead. Completely different format than our other show, which is called The Interview Room. Comes out Thursday mornings at 0500. Please be sure to check those out. Last week we had Sergeant Michael Segru on the episode. We discussed his book, Relentless Courage, and it was a great conversation, and it's a great book. Really, if you're in law enforcement, I think you need to read that book. So go back and listen to that episode. And this week, I've got Scott Medlin. So another great episode. Be sure to follow us. So completely different format. This is a monologue show. That's an interview show. So I encourage you to check that out. So without taking any more time, let's go ahead and get into this week's news. The first story I want to go over, I'm going over pretty much solely because we actually just went over the initial story of this guy smashing up McDonald's in the Manhattan. In the words of the philosopher Eminem, no, not the little green and brown guys, the singer, look who's back again. And so he's back. Our gentleman, who this time is allegedly spray painting graffiti in Brooklyn, then swiped a pricey bike to flee from cops. So Michael Palacios, I couldn't pronounce his name last time, really can't pronounce it this time, I'm still trying. He was found Sunday after he was spraying graffiti, and then he takes off and he snatches a bicycle from a coffee shop, and police then get into a chase with him. And he is found with this graffiti paraphernalia, and they assume that he is the same guy who has been doing multiple other incidents. He was charged with grand larceny, which would be a theft statute, depending on where you're from. Up there, it's called larceny. 2 counts of criminal mischief, possession of stolen property, making graffiti, and possession of graffiti instruments. And they've since dropped some other charges. He refers to the McDonald's incident where he claims, quote, that he is not unhinged, but rather he was simply defending himself. Definitely go back and check out that video. I'll drop that episode in the show notes so you can go back and watch that episode. But I'm not so sure that it looked that way on camera, but again, benefit of the doubt. But he was arraigned on charges of criminal mischief and weapons possession and what looked like assault, but maybe they determined the assault wasn't there, in that incident in the McDonald's. However, he was released without bail. And so he decided what he ought to do is go out and spray graffiti on things and steal bicycles. So I guess if you don't have anything else to do while you're awaiting trial, it's something to do. I'm just not suggesting it. So I get it. it's not a violent crime, right? And I get that thinking, but this is broken windows theory, right? At some point, if you're like smashing up McDonald's one day and then spraying graffiti over here the next day, and then threatening people with an axe another day, and then stealing a bicycle another day, yeah, you're on a path that isn't going to end good, right? Like, it's probably time that we step in as a justice system and say, enough is enough with this action. You're just not going to do it anymore. So that's my thoughts on it, but I just wanted to bring you up to speed. Our second news story that I want to go over this week, because I think this one is super important. This is coming to us from Breitbart News, and it was from October 10th. This is, quote, the title of this: FBI, over twice as many killed with knives, cutting instruments than rifles. Huh. That doesn't seem like what the legacy media tells me all the time. It's very disappointing. So the FBI's UCR, which stands for Uniform Crime Report, shows that twice as many people were killed with knives than other cutting tools than were killed with rifles in 2021. Okay. So 1,035 people were killed with knives or cutting instruments, and 447 in 2021 were killed with rifles. But it's not that simple, right? Nothing ever is. So it actually fluctuates year from year. So if you're going to look at other years, well, what does that look like, right? So Breitbart goes back and said, well, in 2020, it was 3.5 times different. So in other words, 454 people were shot and killed with rifles in 2020 to 1,732 that were stabbed or hacked to death with knives or cutting instruments. In 2019, 4 times as many people were stabbed to death in 2019 than were killed with rifles of all kinds. 375 with rifles, this is the 2019 stat, to 1,525 with knives and cutting instruments. So, and then they look back to 2018, and it was 5 times more likely to have been killed with a knife or cutting instrument than a rifle. And they go on to state that categories of rifles is all of them. So it includes bolt action, pump action, brake action, semi-automatic. And then, of course, they go on to say that there are those that label the semi-automatic ones assault weapons. More people have been stabbed or hacked to death in 2018, 2019, 2020, and 2021. Those 4 years, more people than all of them than have been killed with such rifle types combined. Isn't that interesting? So, I don't know, maybe it's studies like these that are using just simple crime reporting stats, UCR, FBI's UCR. Maybe it's time for rational people to start blaming criminals and holding them accountable. Maybe that is where we need to start putting our efforts. I don't know. There's an election coming up. So if maybe you know anybody who's running for any office, I don't care what party they're with, maybe this is a conversation you have with their office that, hey, I got an idea. Let's hold bad people. Let me rephrase that. Let us hold people who make bad decisions and do bad things accountable for those actions, instead of trying to legislate things that affect law-abiding citizens, which clearly by the numbers makes zero to no sense. All right, so the third story for you this week, 2 probationary officers resign after facing criticism for not shooting armed suspect during a pursuit. This is coming to us from Police One. I hate these stories, right? And so I'm bringing it to you more as a cautionary tale. So 2 Fairfield Township probationary officers were hired within the last year, and they recently resigned after being reprimanded for this incident. Well, essentially, the armed suspect, a 25-year-old, he shoots an individual during an argument at a gas station, and he flees. He's leaving out of there, and a Good Samaritan, member of the public, a citizen, sees him and keeps an eye on him, presumably from a distance, from a safe distance, because there's nothing indicating that there's any kind of interaction between these two. So he's just kind of keeping an eye on him and reporting this to law enforcement. So he makes the bad guy makes his way over to another township. And it is there where Butler County and Fairfield Township police both respond to this scene. And the witness who's observing this whole thing unfold, he's on the phone with 911, and he goes, they're telling him to stop. He won't stop. He's running in the woods. They got their guns drawn. Well, essentially what eventually happens, which is what you've probably guessed, is that the suspect flashes a gun in the direction of the officers, and then Hamilton police respond by shooting the suspect, which obviously, based on what is being said here, if this is all accurate, that's 100% justified. You know, they're met with a deadly force threat, and they return deadly force. Fairfield Township officers did not use their guns to open fire. Again, we don't know all the details, so I always give the benefit to those on scene, to those who possibly do know all the details, or to the outcome of the investigation. I think that's very important, something we talk a lot about on here. But the kicker, the concern with this is, quote, so this is coming from the chief of police of Fairfield Township, quote, they observed a weapon in the suspect's right hand, and for one reason or another, they did not stop the threat. So one of the officers mistakenly deployed a taser, which is not the appropriate weapon when you're facing a firearm, a lethal firearm, end quote. He is absolutely correct, and that's what's concerning. That's what scares me a little bit. And we have these conversations. In fact, I'm hoping to bring on some other officers, and I want to have like a roundtable conversation around this subject. But there's two dynamics here, right? There are incidents that whatever force is reasonable to stop the suspect, to stop the threat, that is what you want to do. And it is low on that continuum, if you would. We don't really do continuums anymore, but it is low on that threshold as possible, obviously, for the safety of all involved. But if you're in a deadly force situation, you have to be willing and ready to use deadly force if that is what the situation calls for. So the chief goes on and makes this statement that, quote, they are good people, but at some point in time, they made the decision that they couldn't take a human life if they had to, and the best thing for them to move on is to move on. And sadly, that's absolutely true. If you're faced with a deadly force situation and you cannot use deadly force, which, as if you've listened to me for any length of time or heard me on any other podcast, I always say it's not about taking a life. I was always taught that it's about saving a life, right? We use deadly force to save a life, your life or somebody else's. That's what it's there for. It's not about taking a life. Ultimately, someone may lose their life, but the actual action in the why is to save lives, to save your life or save someone else's. So it's sad that one went that way. That I hear, I see, I read these things on social media, and I have concerns. Right? I have concerns with the direction we're going, and where officers feel that they're in a situation where they can't take the force necessary to stop a threat. That shouldn't be happening. And if they can't do it, as this chief said, then it is time to move on. And if they know that about themselves, it's time to move on. And if they're coming to the career and they're going through the process and they realize this, through the academy process, that I can't do this, well, it's time to move on. So it's a tragic situation all the way around. I'm glad that no officers were injured due to the not taking action, and no other members of the citizenry were injured. But I hate those kind of stories. All right, for the last story, I call this the one crazy thing, even though this week really isn't all that crazy. However, I find it quite interesting. So sometimes it's something crazy. Sometimes I just throw out interesting factoids. Like last week, we talked about jeans that sold for $87,000. If you haven't heard about that one, make sure you go and watch last week's Morning Roll Call. But today, I want to go over Neil deGrasse Tyson, the American astrophysicist, author, and science communicator. He did a fact check on Top Gun Maverick, which I find hilarious on one level anyway, because I don't think anybody really believes Hollywood movies. In fact, if you do, well, maybe people do. Maybe that's why we're seeing some of the other things we're seeing in society. But I would guess, or venture a guess, that most rational people do not buy into Hollywood movies. However, he fact checks this one. Spoiler alert, I'm sure I'm going to say something that may spoil it if you haven't seen it, but I have a feeling that if you're listening to this podcast, you have probably already watched Top Gun Maverick, so I'm not that worried about going over this. But essentially, Neil deGrasse Tyson put out a series of tweets fact-checking it. So he starts, Late to the party here, but in this year's at Top Gun movie, at Tom Cruise's character Maverick ejects from a hypersonic plane at Mach 10.5 before it crashed. He survived with no injuries. I love his symbolic statement here where he does a great comparison. At that airspeed, his body would splatter like a chainmail glove swatting a worm. Just saying. He goes on, at supersonic speeds, air cannot smoothly part for you. You must pierce it, which largely accounts for the difference in fuselage designs between subsonic and supersonic planes. For this reason, the air on your body, if ejecting at those speeds, might as well be a brick wall. Hence the whole chainmail and the worm thing. Splat. When Maverick ejected at Mach 10.5, he was going 7,000 miles per hour, giving him 400 million joules of kinetic energy. The explosive power of 100 kilograms of TNT, a situation that human physiology is not designed to survive. You don't say. Huh. So no, Maverick does not walk away from this. He be dead. Very dead. In this year's at Top Gun movie, they dangerously fly under the radar through a narrow, winding canyon to destroy a target, avoiding multiple banks of surface-to-air missiles. But why not first take out the missile banks? Could then just fly without daredevil maneuvers. Just saying. So I think he brings up a good point in his tweets. In fact, I think they're absolutely hilarious. But one of the directors, or the director and cinematographer, make the statement, it's just like making a play. You create the performance and rehearsal, and then it's performed, and they go on to all the different things they did. There was 813 hours of aerial footage that was used to create the movie and so forth. This is all linked up in the show notes if you want to read it. But you know what? I think at the end of the day, it was a great movie. It was enjoyable. So believe it or not, things happen in movies that are not real life. Shocking. Something to think about is next. All right. So this week, for something to think about, I had a conversation with some people that I work with. I can't be very specific here, but essentially I was speaking with someone who did something different for a while. They were working with a different set of people, different leadership, and so forth. And one of the things that came out of this conversation was it was a situation where things weren't normal, right? So they were responding to something where it wasn't the day-to-day, the typical law enforcement requirements. So what they were doing, being different, meant that they were working with different people who were giving them orders and so forth on how to handle it. But then they were also dealing with people that they didn't typically work with. And what they noticed is that some people stepped up to the occasion. Some people went over and above. Some people said, hey, something needs to be done here. Citizens need something. I'm going to do whatever it takes. It doesn't matter what that is. And then others employed this whole not my job philosophy, right? This idea that, well, that's not my role. That's not what I do. I'm supposed to, whatever that is, I guess, protect and serve. But clearly a little less on the serve part in their scenario and a little bit more on the protect side, I guess. So we were kind of talking about this, and they said, it's really sad because they were saying that it almost seems like there's this generational thing where there's a lot of people who just don't want to do any more than is asked, any more than is expected. They just don't want to step outside their, whatever the expectation or whatever my job description is and do what is needed in a situation. And sadly, as we were talking, I was thinking, I've seen this a lot lately. And coming full circle, this last week I was in a class where it was ABLE, and ABLE is active bystandership for law enforcement. And one of many key things that they were talking about is this concept that when one person does the right thing, others will follow. But if nobody does anything, then a lot of times inaction breeds inaction, and action will breed action, right? So if one person sees that something needs to be done, then it's highly likely that others will be like, you know what, they're doing it, so let me jump in here and do it with them, right? So this whole idea of doing more, stepping up, going the next level, it's popular, right? So like Nick Bare with Bare Performance nutrition. He uses the go one more. A lot of times that go one more mindset, he isn't really using it in this context. He's using it more in like the fitness context or the, like with your business, but always be willing to go one more step. That's applicable here, right? That's applicable to just our everyday job, our everyday working with people. You've got to be willing to go one more step. When I was a young employee, I worked in retail. Kmart doesn't even exist anymore. So I was working for Kmart, and I remember having a boss that told me, hey, listen, you always have to be busy. You always have to, there's no such thing as downtime, right? So you have breaks, you have lunch, but if you're not in those contexts, then you need to be working. And they said, if you want to separate yourself from everybody else, what you've got to do is have the mindset that I'm always going to find something to do, even though no one is directing me to do something. So in other words, let's say in the retail environment, you're setting up an end cap, or maybe you're cleaning up an aisle, or whatever that case may be, and you get that done, and no boss is right there over your shoulder to say, go do this or go do that. Find something to do. Go grab a broom, and start sweeping the floor. Go grab a box out of the stockroom and start stocking shelves. Find something to do in whatever environment it is. It was this whole idea of when you work for a man, you work for him, and you do exactly anything and everything you can within that time slot that you work for them, because they're paying you for your labor, so you labor, and that's the expectation. So I saw this continued even in the landscaping industry, right? Because the same concept applies to any job that you may work. In landscaping, it was a good way to build a business, because if you always do more than they expect, people love that. People resonate with your brand. They're like, we love you guys. I hired you to do this and you did just a little bit more. And it means something to them, and they remember you and they recommend you to other people. It's no different in law enforcement, since we provide a service to the community, right? And since we provide a service to the community, we need to be able to do what we can. And we have to fix this not my job mentality. I remember early on in law enforcement, one evening, nothing too crazy was going on. Call screen was good. And I get called out to a house where essentially my house is flooding. Well, the house wasn't flooding. In fact, the house wasn't flooding at all. The yard was flooding. And the reason the yard was flooding is because there was an issue with a sprinkler valve. Well, my expertise happened to be sprinkler valves. So I could have said, you got the wrong guy. You need to call an on-duty plumber, call the landscape guy, call whatever. But it was a simple problem. It wasn't one that put me at risk or anything else. And it was something that I could easily solve for him. Is not the right thing to do in that situation to do it, to help them out, to provide that service to the community? I mean, yeah, is that what law enforcement does? No, they don't typically fix sprinklers. They don't typically fix valves. That's just not the way it's done. But by doing that, you give that goodwill to the community, to the people that you serve, and it's going to come back. So I remember early on when I was younger, my dad used to always say that, with the military and so forth, you don't volunteer, right? They come around, hey, I need a volunteer for this. The rule of thumb was, well, you just keep your hands down. You never be that guy that, hey, yeah, pick me, right? And I didn't go into the service. Some other things happened, and go more in that into a different podcast. But but that's what my dad had said when I was much younger. But when I came into law enforcement, I actually had a sergeant who quickly rose to captain, and probably for this very reason, tell me exactly the opposite. And I will say that hands down, it's been probably some of the best advice I've gotten in the law enforcement career. And that is the opposite of that statement. Instead of don't volunteer, always volunteer. Always be the guy that's willing to raise his hand and say, you need somebody? I'm your guy. What is it that you need? When the captain comes, when the lieutenant comes, when your sergeant is saying, hey, I need somebody to do X, be the person willing to fill in whatever that is. Fill in the gap. Go one more. Go above. Do more than is expected. I probably can't give you any better advice than this when it comes to success in not only law enforcement, but in life in general, right? When we choose to be the kind of person who's always willing to do more than is expected, is loyal to the department, and not with a blind loyalty, but loyal to the department and to the community, has a strong work ethic, and then has a positive spirit no matter what the task is at hand, you're going to be unstoppable, whether it's in law enforcement or in life. So that's what I want to leave you with this week. Everyone have a great week. All right, so before I let you go, we always read reviews. Please, 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 especially on Apple Podcast and on YouTube. If you would, down below, leave us a comment, leave us a review, leave us 5 stars, please. And definitely like each episode. All that stuff, I know I say it every week. It's very redundant, but it helps immensely with algorithms. And as this builds, it's going to become more and more important. But as I promised, I'm going back through the archives. If you do leave a comment or a review on Apple Podcast or on YouTube, I will read it on a future episode. So right now I'm catching up on some old ones. So this comes from a couple years ago, but it says, "Thank you. As someone who wants to go into law enforcement, I truly appreciate the perspective of a veteran officer. I also appreciate that Wayne encourages off-duty aspects of life as well, because being a law enforcement officer is not the sole purpose of life, but an aspect of who a person is. I'm excited to see where this goes and to have a lifeline, so to speak, once I am on the job, to serve as a reminder to nurture all aspects of my life. Thank you for starting this podcast." Well, you are welcome. Thank you for leaving the rating and review, and thank you to each and every one of you who tune in week after week. All right, so that does it for this week's Morning Roll Call. I'm going to see you Thursday in the interview room, but in the meantime, I'll see you out there on the Blue Line.